There are lots of things on the farm, and everyone has their favorite. On this farm, it's chickens and tractors. Hi, today we're going to make Walthers chicken coop and shed, part of the diorama I'm making for the 2022 build-off. First up were modifications. The exterior was grained, weathered, and some boards damaged. Next, we scratch-built a roof for the chicken coop just to wreck it. The coop roof was scratch-built from some scale styrene 2x4s. The rafters were all cut to length, then glued to some planking. I first thought the roof was metal, but after making a damaged foil roof, I realized it was tar paper. I drew a hole, planked out the edges, then filled the rest with some manila folder cardstock. Now that the modifications were made, everything could be primed. The exterior was coated with hairspray, then painted, Vallejo fire red with white trim. The walls were weathered using water to activate the hairspray and a stiff paintbrush, taking into account how the building is sited. I started chipping as soon as the paint was dry to the touch, which was too soon, as it wanted to all come off at once. Next time I'm going to let it dry more. Because I wasn't happy with the chipping, I decided to dry brush in some extra, and then added some highlights. Here, the trim is painted white. The window frames are then installed, and the interior painted in a wood grain. Next, the glass was installed in the window frames. This kit came with some nice thin acetate instead of the thick styrene that the farmhouse came with. And because most of the windows were tiny, I only damaged 2 of them on the chicken coop. Now we're gonna glue everything together. All the walls were glued together. The lean-to, the chicken coop, and the machine shed. Now we will finish the lean-to because it is the simplest structure. The base gets a coat of chalk paint to represent concrete. Then the roof gets sanded to remove the molded-in tar paper detail. Tar paper was created from black construction paper, lightly coated with gray paint, and then portions of it with flat black. It was cut into 36 scale-inch wide strips. Then it was weathered by placing it on the edge of a board and sanding the edge to reveal the different layers of paint and some of the raw construction paper. The roof was then covered with the weathered tar paper, starting from the bottom. The construction paper tar paper looks far better than any way I can think of painting the original plastic. The roof was installed. For some reason, gluing the paper on the roof caused it to bow slightly, fortunately in the right direction for a rundown shed. The lean-to is attached to the machine shed, and this part of the structure is finished. Up next was the fuel tank. First, the parts were assembled and the seams filled and sanded. A base coat of rust color was next, dark old rust on the top and a lighter shade blended on the bottom. Then it was coated with hairspray, and the final color, a light blue, was put on. The blue was then chipped, revealing the rusty metal below. I added a golf logo. This adds some character to the tank and let me try a new-to-me technique. I found an image of the logo and printed it out at the proper size on regular printer paper, but mirrored. I cut out one for each side, then glued them on with Mod Podge. The Mod Podge was allowed to cure for about a day and a half. Then I started to dissolve the paper with plain water. It was allowed to soak for about an hour. I wanted to disturb the printer toner as little as possible. The paper was gently scrubbed off using a cotton swab, revealing the logo firmly adhered to the tank. The background should be painted white before attaching the decal. I forgot, but the light blue worked pretty well, especially since this is an old tank. Here's the final result. One of the logos is upside down. I wonder how that happened. Must have been made on a Friday. Man, I love Fridays. Relax, kick back, have a couple beers, unwind from the stress of the week. Lunchtime's over. We gotta go decal some tanks. Okay, let's go. My father grew up on a farm and had a knack for all things mechanical. He moonlighted as a tractor mechanic on and off, and I can still remember the smell of the shop. A cocktail of old oil, new tires, and Gojo. In honor of him, there's going to be an old tractor in the middle of a repair left in the machine shed. And the first thing we need is a hoist to support the engine. We're going to scratch build it. The first thing to be done is a scale drawing of the frame, inspired by one I saw in a video. The drawing was then glued to a piece of wood, holes drilled at the bends, and pieces of welding rod jammed in the holes to make a jig. I was going to make the hoist from 20 gauge copper wire, but when I dug it out, I realized it was all very curved and pretty weak. So instead, I used some welding rod of about the same diameter, which is strong and arrow straight. It's also copper plated, so I can solder the frames together. Each side of the frame is made from 3 main pieces, a tall and short outer frame and a tall inner frame, and 3 support pieces, 2 braces between the short outer frame and the inner frame, and a brace between the 2 tall frames at the top. The two outer pieces were bent on the jig and soldered together. The top brace and inner frame were soldered using a 1-2-3 block for support. Next, the lower braces were cut and superglued in place. There were enough solder joints now that I feared undoing them and trying to add more. The upper beam was crafted from some scale lumber and glued together with a little superglue. Rollers were cut from a toothpick sanded down to the right diameter, and plates were cut from manila cardstock. The hoist was assembled and then painted orange. Completion of the hoist would wait until we were ready to hang the Farmall engine from it. Now we will look at the tractor itself. This is the only 3D printed part in this build. I set the printer to work making 4 copies, then tried to edit the model in Blender to get the individual parts. That worked for the back half of the tractor and the engine, but for everything else it ended in frustration as I would delete some critical node I didn't mean to and mess it up. So printing the 4 copies was a good move, as I used most of them to get all the parts, plus some extra clutter. After everything was printed and cut up, I laid them out on the machine shed floor. I also built 2 benches from scale styrene and cardstock that are seen here. The floor was then weathered with some oil stains and a wash. Some scale lumber was cut up into a stack of 4x4s to support the back half of the tractor. Everything was detail painted. Then I used some costume jewelry chain to hang the engine. This was very fiddly and didn't work out as well as I wanted. The chain ended up a little kinked and not hanging straight. Next, all the detail parts were glued to the machine shed floor, setting the scene for an old Farmall tractor that was abandoned in the middle of a repair. The chicken coop is next. Now we finish the roof using the previously made tar paper strips. The lighter gray ones are used as they look more weathered and help explain why the roof has a hole in it. The back of the paper in the hole area was wetted with a little water, then left to soak for a while before poking the hole through and getting the paper to drape over the edges. The cut scraps were saved for the floor. A floor was crafted from a thin piece of plywood. Boards were marked out and then scribed with a hobby knife. Then the center was distressed to indicate damage from the collapse. It was stained with some AK wood effects. It came out looking pretty good. A pile of debris was created and placed under the hole. Some chopped up wood bits stained with the same AK stain, the tar paper scraps, and some blended leaves were soaked with alcohol and then diluted white glue. The roof was fitted to the walls. Slots had to be cut for the rafter tails to stick through. This roof also developed quite a bow, which straightened a bit when the roof was installed but looked just right for the hole it has. The last step before gluing the floor on was attaching the signs. There was a story attached to the signs. Let's attach the story to the signs while we attach the signs to the coop. While my wife didn't grow up on a farm, they did live in the country and tried to raise chickens once upon a time while she was very young. She loved the chickens and picked one who would later earn the moniker Brokey as her favorite. While she loved them, she was disappointed they didn't fly like all the other birds and decided to teach them. Lesson 1 did not go so well, even with the huge head start and altitude provided when she tossed them as high in the air as she could. Brokey couldn't stay aloft and came back to earth with a thud. Poor Brokey just earned his nickname, as one of his wings was now indeed broken. Undeterred, she decided to nurse him back to health, and flying lessons would resume in earnest once he was better. It was then disaster struck. Brokey ran away. She was devastated and sobbed inconsolably. In fact, the only thing that gave her comfort was Mom's famously delicious Sunday chicken dinner, and she alternated between sniffing back tears, lamenting Brokey's departure, and marveling at how good that drumstick was. Yep, her mom connected those dots a few decades later. But now Brokey has been immortalized. We have 3 signs in the style of a 5-year-old. The first is for the chicken flying school. The second is pleading for Brokey to come home. And the third is offering a reward for the missing chicken's safe return. Only a few things left. The roof of the machine shed was painted. A light rust color was airbrushed on in irregular patterns based on a reference photo. I had always assumed standing seam metal roof would likely rust in the middle of each panel and spread from there, but the photo showed essentially random patches that spanned panels, so that's what I went for. Darker colors were added in the centers of the patches. Finally, a darker shade of gray was brushed between the patches. The reference photo looked like this. I assume the dark areas were galvanizing, the light areas were where it flaked off and eventually rusted. As the final step of assembly, the walls were glued to the base, then the doors were installed, and that was the end. Now let's look at the final reveal. that brings us to the end of this build. Thanks for watching, and if you liked what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe, and come back for more.